Okay, well, people can join us as we start. Right, so welcome everybody. Welcome to the British Chamber's first live webinar in this COVID lockdown period. Really want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us and to really join us at the start of our online community, which I believe we're going to be building and pushing, particularly in the coming weeks. The next hour and a half, we're going to have an opportunity to discuss perhaps the more strategic macroeconomic impacts of what's going on in COVID, get ourselves into the clouds and the blue sky talking about what this means for the new world of work, and then hopefully kind of take questions from everybody that's in the audience in terms of what are you finding is most frustrating now? What are you observing in your businesses? What's front of mind? And giving you some real practical tips of way to navigate this current pandemic crisis going forward. Equally, given this is our first live webinar, it's a bit of an experiment in terms of what is the best way to do this, to conduct this. So we welcome feedback. A few housekeeping rules. Use the questions so we can see the live questions coming in. I think if you mute yourselves, then of course, that'll minimize the noise and make sure we can hear each other. I'm going to be essentially refereeing, steering Colin and John, who many of you know, but let me introduce them. I've got John Foster-Pedley, Dean and Director of the Henley Business School, the only triple accredited business school in Africa, the only British business school in Africa, the University of Reading. There we go, top 1% in the world, and has an amazing advertising strategy. If you ever drive down William Nicol, you can't miss Henley. And Colin, Iles, founder of Innovation Catalysts. You'll know that I've done events, and we've done events with both of them before. Yeah, this is our first online iteration. So let's see how I get on steering the conversation when we're probably about 30 kilometers apart. So firstly, I think it would be great to explore the primary themes. And as we're going on, please feel free to post questions, interject, and I'll try and respond to them. I've got the team here with me online as well. Cecilia, Vice President, Membership and International Networks, who's actually just jumped off a Zoom with our global network of British Chambers. Emma, who's our Head of Digital, and Leslie, our Head of Events. Thank you all for helping us put this together and the rehearsals over the weekend. And of course, Bernice, who is our operational backbone. So now we know who's in the room, and please say hello virtually. Kicking off the background, where are we right now, gentlemen, in terms of what are we seeing as a pandemic? What are the things that spring to mind when we talk about COVID-19 this morning?
Yeah, so
I'll hand over to you, Colin. Yeah,
I'll just kick off there. I think you think back to December. Fascinating, because in December no one had ever heard of COVID-19, and now there can't be anyone in the world that hasn't just heard of it, but it hasn't impacted their lives in one way or another. Oh, welcome to Cecilia there, our other panelist. So this is definitely a crisis, but it's an exponential crisis. And normally I spend my time working with organizations, helping them to deal with the threats and opportunities that exponential technologies bring. This fast evolution that we're seeing in areas, particularly around things like AI, which are changing everything. Every day there's a new startup that's challenging an incumbent in a particular industry. So the world, I think, is getting somewhat used to exponential change, but I don't think it's ever seen anything quite like COVID-19, where you go from December to today, and despite the memes and the jokes that are out there, we're suddenly sitting there with about 750,000 people that have been impacted. And I think it's worth just going through the numbers, because it's really difficult to get your head around logarithmic scales and exponential scales. We just don't, I think, do it particularly well. 700 to 750,000 infections that have been identified today. This means that in the next 24 to 48 hours, we're going to top 1 million. It means that by, let's say, Saturday or Sunday, we are going to be at 2 million. 4 or 5 days later, it's going to be 4 million. And if there were no interventions at all from any governments anywhere in the world, and we were really left to just go and take our own approach to go and try to solve for this and prevent it, those numbers are going to continue scaling for the next number of months. And you would eventually get to a plateau where the only real resistor for the infection rates would be that we've all been infected. And those that have survived have effectively become immune. And then at some point you start to see the reverse exponential scale, an inverted exponential scale, where it starts to taper off and start to become something that gets consigned to history. So this exponential rate of infection for me is both fascinating, it's devastating, but it's certainly taken the whole of the world by surprise. And therefore, when we go and look at our governments and the interventions that they're taking, you can look back and you can criticize, but it's quite difficult to criticize because it's really difficult. You can imagine just 2 weeks ago here in South Africa, or a week or so back, the intervention that has been taken by the South African government is absolutely incredible compared to what a lot of other countries are doing. Sweden are still not locking themselves down, as an example. America were weeks behind to start their particular lockdowns. Zimbabwe, I see, has just started the process, yesterday. And yet if we look at the data that was there, what we saw happening in places like China and South Korea, it should have been factually a very obvious decision for all countries to lock down as soon as they get one case. But we are finding it incredibly difficult to get our heads around the fact that when you get something that's as infection as this, and it scales so quickly, that the right thing to do is to close it off before you start seeing numbers in the hundreds and the thousands. And obviously when you get to the numbers in the hundreds and thousands, it becomes incredibly difficult to put the cats back in the bag or the feathers back in the pillow. So it's phenomenally interesting in terms of where things are going to go, because it's too late now in some ways to have radically prevented it. And there's going to be some really interesting observations from policy and government over the coming months and indeed the next year or so in terms of how we go and deal with this and manage this particular contagion.
So thanks for that intro, Colin. Before I hand over to John, perhaps everyone can just take a look at their Zoom screens. And if I encourage you to switch to gallery view so you can see all the speakers, and then just steer you towards the Q&A. If you're on an iPad, it's at the top of the screen. And if you look at the controls, and that means you can fire questions live, which Cecilia will be monitoring. And Cecilia, feel free to interrupt us if there's any good questions or any questions that we should respond to. So Colin, I'll come back to that intro. And John, your kind of opening remarks, hearing what Colin said in the overview, before we perhaps explore 4 possible scenarios.
Well, I think Colin said a lot of it, frankly. So thank you, Colin. It's so difficult to predict. At the same time, it's really easy to predict. It's pure mathematics. As Colin said, it's exponential increase. It's a multiplication. The mathematics are very, very clear, very easy to understand. And what confuses it all is our attachments, our emotions, and the things that stop us seeing clearly. So it's fascinating to see the different responses from different countries. What is very clear is that there is a peak. So if you look at the Imperial College report that was done recently, which was a seminal report that influenced the South African, American, British governments to change direction, well, not to change, but influenced the South African government to do what they had to do, it shows that there's a very clear cycle of infection and then decline. And what that, as we all know, shows is that the health systems can't support that. And in various countries, we don't have the testing, we don't have the ventilators and much more, and the staff to manage that. So the human crisis unravels in a way that you can remember, I think, just a few weeks ago, people saying, oh, it's just like flu, isn't it? It's not so bad. And so we're starting to understand, we're all becoming epidemiologists, really, and we're starting to understand the nature of these curves. So the next curve, if you don't let it run, is to do what you might call a sort of herd immunity strategy that Boris Johnson did to begin with. And excuse me if you know all this, I'll just run through very quickly. And that is keeping the most vulnerable out of the way, like the 4-month lockdown for people over 70 in the UK is what is anticipated, if not in practice now, I'm not quite sure. And that allows it to run, but in a controlled way, to build up herd immunity. But what the Imperial College report indicated was you're going to have, the first strategy is going to create millions of deaths, I think 1.5, maybe 2 million deaths potentially in the UK, ridiculous number. The controlled method, which is building herd immunity by keeping the most vulnerable out of the way, is still going to leave 250,000 people dead. Whereas the absolute lockdown isolation method, which is what's happening now, has projections from 20,000, 50,000 around that area. I don't know how true that is because there are so many variables, but we're facing those options now. So as we face those options, we're looking at what we can do in a country like South Africa, and without repeating the obvious, we've got 2.5 million people who are HIV positive, not antiretrovirals, TB, poverty-related crowding, and many, many more things. which means that it's going to be difficult to contain it here. Thank you, that's perfect. So that's the ideal curve. You know, the first one is the red one is the normal curve, or what happens if we do nothing. The social distancing flattens the curve, which you have these recurrences. The moment you stop social distancing, it'll come up again. And the epidemic, and the blue line is the total close down, which reduces the number of cases being reported. And then when you lift some restrictions again, the virus is still there and people get it. So the challenge there is, what are we doing in order to provide time for the healthcare facilities, governments, the doctors to provide potential cures or treatments, and then we hope with the vaccine being produced. Added to that South African context, where we have the potential of enormous social and business damage if we just let this roll, we're faced with really interesting challenges. It's very easy to be a sort of Cassandra and a doomsday sort of person and say everything's going to be gloomy, but in fact it doesn't have to be. Once we know these realities, in fact, there's an awful lot of things we can do. Firstly, we need to get into people's minds the messages. And we're doing it in the wrong way, I think. We need to get celebrities, multiple connectors, people who relate to people, to send the messages out in the proper languages, in easy to communicate ways, not in formal ways. We need to get the social, we need to get the gossip moving in the right way and to kill off fake facts. So we have to do that in a different way. And secondly, we can't sit back and do nothing in our businesses, because at this point, all you're doing if you do that is you're going to guarantee that a recession will be deep and awful. It's an unbelievable learning opportunity to move into digital, virtual companies, etc. So it's changed the world for us all. And as Leon shared a cartoon among us the other day saying, you know, it was a multiple choice question. Who is responsible for the transition of your company to digital and online? It was the CEO, the CIO, the CFO, or coronavirus. And everyone circled the coronavirus. And that's exactly what's happened. So we've got a wonderful challenge ahead of us in the most dire circumstances. So time to pull together. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Colin. Cecilia, how are our audience? Are we getting interactions?
Not so far. I think everyone's just keen to hear a little bit more. I've not got any questions yet, but please, guys, anything, please pipe up at any time.
Yeah, no, thank you. So we'll continue, and I hopefully encourage and trigger some questions and scenarios, particularly when we get to the more operational, tactical piece of what does that mean for our businesses right now. So I think I'll stay in the clouds with Colin and John for a bit longer. Then we'll pull it down to what does that mean for us? What can we do for our businesses? What can we do for ourselves? What can we do as this virtuous ecosystem as a chamber where we can support each other? But really, and again, I knew this would happen. You know, I read overnight, I listen to podcasts. We had a conversation yesterday. For me, something that I'm struggling to get my head around, and again, this is Leon AO talking, not the British High Commissioner of the DIT. Why is it that the world has leaped to action to respond to this virus? And I'll let me kind of give a bit of context to my question. You know, last year, 5 million children died of malnutrition. Last year, 500,000 children died of pneumonia alone in South Africa. The death rate is yet at 100,000. So without being glib and just looking at this statistically, why do you think governments have mobilized so quickly around this topic and not other issues that perhaps on the surface have a far more of a detrimental impact on society? Perhaps I'll hand over to you, Colin.
Yeah, look, the first answer is I don't think they have acted very quickly. So if they were following the maths of what was observed in China, where with no intervention, you have a doubling rate every 3 or 4 days, and you have an infection ratio whereby if you have the illness and you're not locked down, you will on average infect at least 3 or 4 other people, which is, if you compare that to the flu, that's roughly a rate of about 1.2 to 1.4 people. It was incredibly clear that there are going to be millions, hundreds of millions of people being infected within a very, very short period of time. So I don't think governments and organizations and individuals have acted fast enough, in all honesty.
But, and then I'll come to John, but, I'm going to push back on that and say, never before. We had the Hong Kong flu in 1978. We had the Spanish flu 100 years ago. We had the pandemic of HIV. Is it this exponential age, this age of social media and multiple communication challenge that has really reduced, we can talk about the HOGREF, the power distance ratio, whereby we've reduced the power distance ratio, whereby somebody on Twitter can speak directly to the president's office. So do politicians feel more accountable and fearful of action versus inaction? I'm just steering it that way, John. And equally, I welcome our kind of viewers in the audience to kind of share some of their views and observations. I'm really struggling to understand why this kind of, again, draconian measures have been taken through fear. So slightly disagreeing with Colin, but welcome your views, John. Just unmute yourself, John.
Technology. Yeah. Remember when we said that? It was just people saying just like a flu. I mean, I was in Milan. I was one of those people who went skiing in Europe in February in northern Italy, and I obviously was following what was going on in Wuhan, and it seemed like, well, one of the safest places in the world to go to has to be Italy skiing. Nobody's going to be there. And south of Milan, we found all these hotspots, but I managed to escape all that by being early. And then I went to a conference of 3 days in Milan, where we had hand sanitizers, and I was quite careful, but walked through Milan, but it was full of people. Came back a week later, practically it had closed down, and I kept away from people for kind of 2 weeks, obviously. Generally, when I heard about the problem, and was lucky. But I think having that sort of insight just hammers you about you get a sense of realization that social media and the other things offer you. Also, we move a lot more now. We travel. Chinese supply lines, the speed in which we're doing business and mobilizing are important. And I think it's really important to understand that this is actually quite a dangerous thing, COVID. It's 0.1% of people die of flu apparently, and maybe 2% of people die of this, maybe more. So it's 20 or 30 times more dangerous than your normal flus. And its transmission rates are higher than flu. 1.2 is flu, 2.3 I think is this one. And you've got that period of time when people are non-symptomatic but spreading. So, yeah. And then people are really scared, and rightly so, because it doesn't necessarily affect the younger people so much, but the vulnerable and the older it does. So we are now starting to have to think about why we do things. The world has increasingly become interdependent. We've seen that. And I'm not going to get philosophical about capitalistic systems. We're just very simply saying that a profit-based individualistic motive can hardly, has already been under a sufficient challenge with movements like Extinction Rebellion, who are challenging what we're doing to the world and to the oceans, to our skies, to the land, and with global heating because of the consequences of what we do. But it's always been somehow abstracted. But that's been an undercurrent that's filtering through everyone's mind and wondering what to do about it. This is a stark understanding. Suddenly you see the consequences. We've done this and this happens. If we don't put these actions into place, we don't work interdependently, then we're all at danger. That's always been the case. The tragedy of the commons is that we use the common lands all together, or the sea or the air, whatever it is, and nobody wants to stop acting on that because you're the first one to lose. In this case, we have to work collaboratively. So I think there are going to be some significant changes. But while that is somewhat philosophical, on a day-to-day basis, you've got people now compounding, getting sick, and they're going to die in our townships very rapidly. And our businesses are going to struggle. Our supply lines are going to challenge. The small and medium enterprises are going to really suffer because of the close down. But actually, they would suffer arguably even more with the amount of deaths and what's going to happen. So I think we've been shuffled into a corner where our realizations of the world we're living in become very stark, and we're going to be forced to work together, and that's not going to be easy, but we will surely manage.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Colin. And I think there's a couple of themes I'd like to come back to there. Was there a question there, Cecilia? Yeah.
There were a few questions. If we can actually, there's a few. If we can stick to John possibly. There was a question, what do you think the impact of executive leadership will be, particularly in the education environment?
Okay, so if it's within the education environment, I mean, it's very interesting because suddenly education, which is about teaching people things to behave in certain ways and give them the skills to be productive and add value in the world, which is what education is about. It's not about slapping qualifications on people and saying, out of my way, I'm an MBA or whatever it is. It's about being able to produce value. Suddenly education has the tools and the methods to communicate change and upskill people. The old model is we spend 3 years and then you're set for 20 years. And of course, that's not happening anymore. So the type of leadership to be offered is really important. And what we need to do as business schools and universities is to, well, we're facing such a brilliant revolution in learning that can be productive. And institutions are very, very wedded to their ways, particularly faculties and academic institutions. So it's going to open up. For example, what we've said at Henley now, and I'm saying this, is that we spent several weeks getting ahead of the game with virtual learning, and we went all online. So I'm putting out an announcement today saying that Henley Business School is going to share all our innovations, insights, methods, learnings that we've had in getting ourselves up to speed with all the other universities and higher education institutions in the country for absolute free. And we're going to start a series of seminars to spread all those learnings out to everybody. Because the idea that the competitive advantage is going to help you is really questionable in a collaborative world. And we have to collaborate. We have to collaborate to make the pie bigger, or collaborate to shift the terrain. When we collaborate to do that, we compete within it. Like the Chamber of Commerce, there's a collaboration of competitors, if you want to. We collaborate to make the circumstances better, and then we compete. We need rivals, not enemies, in business. And this is going to be a very interesting transition, I think.
Yeah. I think also James Elkington had a few questions, if we can maybe jump back to that. Let's just get to that. James was asking, James from Cape Town, thank you for joining us. What percentage of essays, we're jumping around a little bit, but I think it's important that we try and get to the questions. I see quite a few questions popping up now. What percentage of essays workforce do we estimate are lockdown and productive? And secondly, lockdown and unproductive? And also, how long do we predict the essay lockdown will continue?
No,
I think that one might be open to a lot of members as well.
They're two really difficult questions, but thinking about the workforce in South Africa, it's not going to be pretty. There are potentially very few people, a few million, maybe 5 at most, who could even think about working from home because they've got access to the internet and the technology. Then you've got to go and reduce that further because they might not be doing roles. There's a huge service industry here, or a lot of physical roles that are there where they just don't have the type of jobs where they can actually work from home. So if you're in, I don't know, banking, consulting, education, I don't know, anything that's really delivering service products with ones and zeros, so you're able to go and move swiftly and work from home, you're dealing in data, then it's probably quite high. And I think that they're going to find that they are amazed about how productive their teams can be working from home. There's ample amounts of evidence globally, just in normal circumstances, from companies that have their whole teams working from home. If they're got access to technology, they've got the capability, and they're in the sort of industry where you can actually go and do that. But I think that's an incredibly low percentage of our GDP, if you want to put it in those terms, in South Africa's context, and therefore isn't particularly useful for the overall recovery of South Africa. In terms of the lockdown, if we are being able to go and release after what we've seen elsewhere in the world within 21 days, and also what we're just seeing out on the streets. I mean, I'm locked down, so here I'm just totally based on what's coming through on the news flow. There are still hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people going out, whether it's just for shopping or to try to get social grant checks or trying to get home, who are more than capable of spreading the virus. And clearly, if you go into those densely populated areas and townships where you've got multiple people living in very small areas, I'm going to be fascinated. Well, fascinated is the wrong word. I hope that 21 days is the end, but I just do not believe that 21 days will be the end for this lockdown.
Yeah. I think if I can add to what Colin has said on the first question from James in Cape Town about productivity and unproductivity, I think with our rather large unskilled and manual workforce, that's going to be a problem, obviously. But even those who do have the capacity to work from home and who've done so, I get the feeling that that's more been a case of an emergency measure, a once a day or once a day per week situation for most people and companies who've even allowed that. I think what we will now see very quickly is how do we manage teams of people consistently working from home day after day. I do think that's something very new to us, and I do think we'll lose quite a bit of productivity there. Angel Jones from Homecoming Revolution was talking about how this will impact our talent demand and the changes in talent, demand for different talent that we're going to see in the market. Angel's listed a few things, healthcare, of course, education, e-learning. We're going to be looking for talent and skills in that area specifically. I think add to that, and John, I don't know if you already possibly include that in some of your curriculums, but I think in your MBAs, managing remote teams, managing remote businesses completely is going to become much more prominent. I think we're having a test run like never before. I don't think everyone expected it to happen so quickly. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think Cecilia, if I jump in, and thank you for the questions, and we can see some more that we'll come back to. Good observations from more panelists. I'm thinking, Colin, maybe while John's reflecting on that question from Cecilia, could we put a poll out to determine if people are feeling productive? It is quite interesting. I think we're in this, one of the key learning points that I think I've picked up in the last 4 days, which feels like 4 weeks, is how do you get through the kind of exercising an element of gratitude? Firstly, that I have the technology and capacity to engage with my team, and then to certainly engage with our members and indeed clients. You should see a poll coming up now where Colin's sharing some of the questions so we can perhaps share our collective views. Also gratitude for being safe and having the space in which, I don't live in informal settlement. Many of you have probably seen the social media commentary around being stuck at home to being lucky to be at home is perhaps a mindset shift. But back to Cecilia's question to you, John, while the polls are going out. How have our MBAs and leadership management training prepared us for managing an agile remote workforce?
It depends. I mean, there's, while MBA has 3 letters that cover everything, and it has certain certification requirements, an MBA is really an opportunity to do many things, and they all vary But I think that it depends on the modality of what you do. These days, a lot of MBAs are using a lot more virtual engagement. They're working hard with remote teams. We work a lot in teams, etc. But I don't think, I think you can teach this stuff. It's really important to teach the elements of it. But it's not even teaching the technology. It's changing the way we think. But there's a very good expression also, which we act our way into a new way of thinking. So I think what we're being forced to do with this is act differently, and a new thinking element will emerge. We often think that education is about, let's teach people things, they'll get it, and then they'll act differently. But very often you've got to get people into an experiential mode to break those deep habits that we have. Mm-hmm. So the MBA and all education is changing radically. We went to 100% virtual. We managed to do it in 2 weeks, and it's working really well. And with our teaching, we've got people in the UK who are very keen from their bedrooms and offices, whatever, to be communicating. They make a nice little studio or use the Zoom virtual backgrounds, and it's working well. But I think what's the main trouble with most of our education is that in spite of its protestations, it's still wedded within a Milton Friedman sort of version of make as much profit you can with as few social consequences or as few negative consequences as you can. It's still working on, if I as an individual push myself up and you as an individual do and I do, then the tide rises and we rise with it. What we've seen though is that model has had far too great terrible consequences. We can see it in the fewer animals we have, the quality of our air, the quality of the oceans, and also the social consequences. South Africa has the highest Gini coefficient in the world, which means that we have the highest difference between the rich and the poor of any other country. Now, how can that work in a situation of COVID? And has that happened because people are incapable? It hasn't happened that way. It's happened because the consequences of these economic actions are that we create problems elsewhere that the companies don't have to pay for or account for. The government is supposed to, or society is supposed to. We are now facing a change of view where all that changes. I'm about to have a cat run across here, so if that happens,
No, thank you, John. And I think really good question. I can see a few more questions that Cecile will make sure we come back to. But I think we're now transitioning perhaps from the kind of broader stratospheric macroeconomic piece to the more strategic organizational piece. And I know John spoke around really shifting our strategy to sharing innovation and what is our purpose. And I know, Colin, we've talked about innovation and purpose. You know, I've often spoken, we, the Chamber, believe we're here to grow our members as individuals and organizations, which means sharing ideas, sharing innovation. And I suppose the current adversarial paradigm of capitalism, perhaps we resist sharing that content. In terms of the exponential world, Colin, pre-COVID, post-COVID, what do you see in terms of the importance of purpose and the ability of sharing that common purpose for an organization?
Yeah.
Easy question for you. Yeah.
Yes.
And I'll just jump in. Sorry, I think, did everybody see that we all seem to think that the lockdown is going to last longer than 21 days? I was hoping for some silver linings, people. Can we have some optimism? But anyway, we'll come back to that.
Thanks, just do the other poll you asked for as well, because it's dead quick. I've just launched it. I'm very curious to see what the response is.
Yeah. Sure. So, and then there's another piece around Zoom etiquette. I'm not sure if we should be able to eat and drink when we're on Zoom. We're all finding this out, but we're learning together, and perhaps we can share some best practice afterwards.
And my dog walks past, and that was my wife, Christine. I don't know if she waved when she walked past. I think it's even better. It's a lot more friendly. And it's lunchtime.
You shouldn't eat, but you can drink, apparently. Not too much.
Okay.
On the if you leave your depends why in the chat line, it'd be interesting. I'm assuming because of the industry or because of certain circumstances. I'm very interested on the nose and the depends about why. I find it really productive working from home, but I've had practice for the last year or so. And I've, obviously trained myself to do it, but it'd be really interesting to see what you post back on the chat. Let me talk about purpose with a bit of I think it needs a bit of background though, because people are coming into this fresh. The argument goes like this. For most companies, in most situations, large or small, the focus is really on generating profits. And although the analysis might be finding market fits and thinking of, interesting ways to go and sell your products and services, the reality is that in a fairly sedate world, you can probably get away with that because, especially if you're a large organization, the economies of scale, barriers to entry, your natural distribution network, your intelligence within, you have a significant advantage. And if nothing changed, if the world didn't change anyway with anything, technology, policy decisions, anything you can think of, then that would be absolutely fine. And I think the shareholders would be quite comfortable. What you're seeing over the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years are more and more organizations that are becoming successful because they are very purposeful in their leadership, purposeful in what they're trying to achieve. So a couple of examples, just some brand names. Tesla doesn't make cars. Their purpose is to make sustainable transport commonplace. Google have always had this kind of do no evil, but organize the world's information type purpose. More locally, if we look at Discovery, although they certainly do try to go and generate a profit, there's no doubt, their purpose is to go and help people to actually live longer. So I think when you are looking at disruptive times, when things are changing incredibly quickly, exponentially, whether it's because of the impact of a virus or because of new technologies which are opening up new opportunities for the Ubers and the Airbnbs of the world, when you see purposeful leadership they have a natural advantage, because I don't know about you guys, if I have the choice of working for someone and they're going to be really boring metrics and will pay you if you do X, Y, Z, versus working for an organization that literally tries to save the world, I'd really want to take that former option. And if you take that former option, then you get huge emotional buy-in. Your clients become your advocates, your staff really start to engage, and maybe they work a bit harder and more experimentally. Your investors give you longer time horizons. Amazon's the master at this. Even your suppliers will start to bend. All your key stakeholders start to invest in the purpose, not just whether they're going to get a financial return. So that's the backdrop, I suppose, the argument about this theme of purposeful leadership. And it's more than just aligning to the sustainable development goals or the normal sort of CSI initiatives. Now we're in this situation where you've got COVID-19 and it's crisis, crisis, crisis. My projection is that companies who are visibly being purposeful about how they are supporting not only their staff, their customers, but the communities and society as a whole, their brand goodwill is going to be elevated multiple times faster than other organizations that are simply trying to go and use the old model of we've got to obviously remain in function, but we're going to try to find profit metrics to go and drive our business strategy. And so there's a massive opportunity, I think, for organizations and leadership teams to do that pivot, to start thinking more purposefully about what their why, if you're a Simon Sinek fan, is in this particular environment that we're living in.
Thanks, Colin. Go to Cecilia.
Sorry, just quickly, this actually touches on what Greta Bile from the section was asking. Do we think that in this particular instance, we tend to see in times like this, you've got the whole social consciousness thing and it's a big boom. Do we think that it will last? Very often these things come and go very quickly. Is this possibly an opportunity for people to actually reinvent themselves, but have a more lasting impact just in people's memories, but also in their corporate footprint and the way that they go forward?
And I'll jump in there, Colin, and perhaps we'll let John answer that question and come back to you. And I just want to speak on behalf of the small, medium businesses, essentially organizations like ourselves, the Chamber, and a lot of our members, that of course we want to add value and have a noble purpose, but we are constrained by our finite resources, particularly around cash flow. So my view is that most people get out of bed in the morning, want to do a good job and add value, not everybody. So being able to have that long view and that kind of real value-adding purpose of extending life like discovery can be somewhat of a luxury. So perhaps we'll just flavor that question with that observation, which I think a lot of our members are probably feeling. And John, perhaps you can answer that as well as Greta Bile's question, and come back to you, Colin.
Thanks. Greta Bile, yes, I do think it's going to last. I think we're at a point in history where these underlying currents have been urging to come out, and I don't think this is. The point is, are we going back to the old normal or not? And I think we have to say the old normal wasn't fit for purpose, and this is going to drive into everybody's head the fact that the new normal is what we need to start creating. We're not used to navigating through change. I mean, management typically is like a thermostat and a radiator. The moment the temperature changes, it tries to bring it back to the same. And this is all about the opposite sort of dilemmas. So I agree with a lot of what Colin was saying, although I wish I could disagree. We'll make for more sort of punchy debate, but I will agree, actually.
You can disagree, I'm ready for you.
Yeah, no, me, you too. So it's going to be great. But let's look at this idea about engagement, because we've got a situation. Well, let's look at emergencies. When you've got an emergency like this, it's not, it's not that easy. Just say, oh, let's all collaborate. Somebody sees the answer. Somebody's got the perception. You've got a command and control situation, and there are things that have to be done urgently, things people need to conform to. That is a situation in that emergency where we have to really. You need strong, clear leadership. You have to do something. But don't confuse that strong, clear leadership with the ego of somebody who says, I must be a strong, clear leader and do all that time. It's situational. Sometimes you do that. We also think that strategy is not immediate. That if you're thinking strategically, it's something deferred to the future. Strategy is immediate. It's not just tactics that are immediate. Strategy are high leverage things. They're questions to which you make decisions which you'll never know if it's right or not, actually. Should you have emigrated to Australia? You know, should you have stayed in China instead of coming back here? Safer in Wuhan, it is here now. So those are sort of strategic decisions. If you want people to really move into a different environment, you can't come to people and say, yeah, be creative or else, or, you know, innovate or else, because it's a voluntary thing. So the style of management needed when you want to get somebody to be more present. I mean, how much of you is welcome at work? How much of you is welcome at work on a day-to-day basis? How much is it a lot of you or little of you? Is it that bit of sort of intellect, conformance, being right, or is it the creativity, the initiative, the passion? And if you've got the basic obedience, coordination, hard work, and intellect, those other things add to it. If you've just got passion and no conformance, you've got chaos. So what we need to do in these situations is get more out of people. So coming back to the point of purpose, you know, if in the old strategy model, you analyze where you are, you analyze where you want to go, and you work out the steps to get there, you know, and that's your strategy plan. That's what a classic strategy plan is. It won't last 5 minutes in a situation like this because the situation is so volatile. What purpose does is give boundaries. Within these areas, you can do a lot. Outside these boundaries of the values and purpose, you don't go there. So leaders who use purpose are setting control boundaries or parameters for people to work within. They're normative rather than rules-based. Within that, you need as much experimentation as you can. So encourage people to experiment on new initiatives, but be ruthless on killing the ones that aren't working and be fast and active about supporting the ones that are. So purpose-driven leaders allow people to work within these sort of novel situations by liberating those other passion, innovation, and creativity, which are voluntary parts of you. They bring that into play, and therefore more of you is welcome at work. And so the purpose-driven leader in this situation is absolutely vital. But don't confuse that also with knowing that there are some things you've got to be really direct and immediate about getting done. So this is a call for all of us to think about how we act in the world and who we act for.
Yeah, I just want to give an example on that to hopefully to get you thinking about it. It's an example I use regularly. If you look at ESCOM's goal, because they don't have a purpose, is to be the single producer, or at least it has been for the last since ever, the single producer of energy to supply it to South Africans and beyond, to do this in a way which is BEE compliant, to go and use this with this particular energy mix, and so on and so on. You can look on their webpage, it goes on endlessly. They don't have a purpose particularly. And I always say, imagine if they did a Tesla where they went and said, our purpose is changed. Our purpose is to make energy as clean, as efficient and available as air. Just mull that one over. If their goal was to go and make energy as clean and available, accessible as air, and for free, just think what types of decisions they might take differently as an organization. It doesn't mean they'd throw away the grid and the existing operating model they've got to go and maintain. But I would hope that 20% of their focus really radically shifts. Maybe they get on that, that telephone call with an Elon Musk and ask if they, like Australia, can have a wee bet about getting a gigawatt park up. Maybe they'd allow micro and blockchain-based photovoltaic innovators to go and start experimenting with grid systems, networked grid systems, which are off, the main grid. Maybe. But what their decisions and the types of people they employ and the way they interface and partner would change radically just by making that purpose incredibly different. So for me, again, I can't only agree with John. We'll disagree at some point, I'm sure. It sets boundaries, but it sets, although they're becoming harder to explain, someone comes to you and says, make ESCOM profitable. It's very easy to work out what that should be as a percentage and to put strategies in place to try to achieve it. The likelihood of achieving it is incredibly low. I think it's much easier to go and get people to do the right thing, to do productive things which benefit a company, an organization, societies, governments, when you are looser by you're saying, this is the purpose, this is the underlying problem, if you want, that we're trying to solve, and we want you to put your heart and soul into doing that. And then obviously you get more experimentation, more autonomy. You get different ideas about how to turn that into, a revenue generating business. So I just wanted to add that as a kind of like a practical example so it can be better imagined.
Thank you, gentlemen. Cecilia, perhaps we can speak to some of the questions.
Yeah, I think this one might be members like Terence and I do from one of our new members, Envision It. I think very clear on their purpose, and what an amazing purpose. But what Terence is saying is what's been really frustrating is having the tool to assist medical staff diagnose COVID-19 through chest x-ray imaging faster, but zero access to government or health departments to provide those tools, with zero profit motive to assist medical staff. So there's a clear purpose that very much feeds into what everyone is saying they want to achieve, but there's a systemic flaw. And I think this is nothing new, but not want to trample on government in any way. But I think this is where a lot of our members often come to us as saying, we've got the solution, we're clear about our purpose, it feeds into what you've asked us to do, but we seem to be running into walls. How do we as a chamber possibly assist in that? How do we as a society, if we can get together and have such a big impact through social media with something like this, can we not also do more when things like this are at our fingertips, but we seem to be paralyzed by inefficiencies?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks, Terence, for contributing. Perhaps, Colin, we've got Sean Jordan Kerwin, the South Africa country director from the UK Department of International Trade, in the audience. Perhaps if we could mute him, he can give us some parish notices about what the British government is doing to help with this, but equally perhaps give us some advice on how to influence government. We'll see if we can unmute him there. And perhaps then, whilst doing that, Sean Jordan Kerwin. Sean Jordan Kerwin.
Sean, you're
Fantastic.
on.
Sean, you can unmute yourself and join, and a great opportunity to welcome you to our chamber members. That's our new country director for the DIT, and also sits on our chamber board along with John. And perhaps while Sean's coming online, John and then Colin can talk to that point that Terence and Cecile have just made, and then we'll come back to the question from Caroline straight afterwards.
Yeah, unfortunately, I've got no great answer. Maybe John has got a better one. You know, just use the simple pre-COVID-19 example. If you want to use the existing structures to solve a problem, it's really, you can just basically say you're not going to solve the problem. If you wanted, for example, to improve the educational system in South Africa, okay, uplift 10 to 12 million kids so that they're not doing maths, which is on the most optimistic benchmark, at least 3 years behind other places like South Korea, Australia, and parts of Europe. You're not going to solve it working with the incumbents. It's just the way it is. But that doesn't mean that you should despair, because I think that what's happening is that technology is opening up huge opportunities for people that are interested in that space. So there's companies like, for example, I think it's called it's just 1 billion, I think that's the name. That's their goal, to uplift educational standards privately for 1 billion people, with partnerships with technology providers to give them access to the equipment. So very cheap iPads and internet connectivity. The course content is already there. Training various people across the globe to be more coaches than teachers. And then we're seeing good results on that, where particularly in subjects like mathematics and physics, which are a bit easier, I think, to do online than say some of the social sciences or some of the more practical ones. They're seeing huge uplifts in people's knowledge sets. So I think the opportunity is there. What it requires is those visionaries who are willing to get into it and to drive it, to be the kind of the crusaders who've got the support around them. And most of them potentially will fail. It doesn't mean don't start, but some of them will succeed. And I think some of them will have profound positive impacts across the world and in South Africa and other parts of Africa.
Thanks, Colin. John, do you care to comment on interacting with governments?
Yeah. It's, habits of mind are really hard to understand in ourselves. And one of the habits we have is this sort of paternalistic view of government. Government must bail us out. And particularly in countries that have maintained a high power distance between government and the people. I worked in New Zealand for a long time, and then that's a very different environment. You know, you stand in the airplane queue in the old days, and there'd be the Minister of Finance sitting next to you without any guards, and without any big deal about what he's doing. He's just going to work. So you get this different sort of dynamic going. So government can't solve this. How can it? We understand that. We understand how difficult it's been with the power structures in the ANC. We understand the 1 trillion rand, perhaps taken by state capture. Wouldn't we like that money now? And we should try and get it back. So government can't do it, and that concept of government can't work, but we can. So there is a certain activism implicit in this. You know, we kind of think of activism as this kind of, you know, revolting people in both senses of the word, you know, fighting against the establishment, but that's not what it is at all. This is about the transition from one form of relevant structure to another quite often, and we're in that point. If we are waiting for permission from government to do this, then we'll never make it. We have to take action, we have to support action. We have, for the first time ever, a sort of collective power possibility where we can really make change. We also have the dilemma between, you know, surveillance and democracy to deal with. Right now, we really would like to have Israeli-style security and Chinese-style security and surveillance and the data to manage everybody's COVID profile so we could isolate them and stop the disease spreading and buy time. And that's happening in other countries. But then people are really worried about the loss of their independence and freedoms. Those are something we have to deal with. We've also got to deal with the dilemma between nationalist instincts and globalization. You know, nationalism can work in some ways short term, but inevitably it evaporates in negative consequences. So that's another thing. The other point is that the economy of South Africa, if you look at the economy of Vietnam 20 years ago, it was small, basically built on crops and textiles, the majority of it, and ICT, manufacturing and engineering was very small in that. You look at and you can get this on the Atlas of Economic Diversity. I think it's a world, I'm not quite sure which publication it is, but look it up. If you look at them now, they've transformed totally into high-tech, ICT, much bigger economy. Rwanda's done the same, a lot of it. Korea did the same, and they've totally changed the dynamics of what they do. So it uses these technologies. They've done it through positivity, social engineering, sometimes through a more autocratic, but one would argue, but more benign way of doing things. And in some places, you've seen these transitions done in very democratic societies as well. You've seen it with Rwanda. But South Africa, if you look at the economic structure of South Africa 20, 25 years ago, it's almost identical now as it was then. You know, coal, mining, go and look on there, it's the same pattern. We haven't transformed the economy. So the government hasn't succeeded in doing that, nor is business, vested interest. We've been through all sorts of other things. Now is the time where we can make those changes happen. Corruption kills transition, and if the corruption doesn't damage the rich people, it damages the poor. It maintains that Gini coefficient. Now is the time for us to be hard on corruption, to stop it, and the government has a role to play in that. We can manage between ourselves with our innovation and coming together around these projects to make a massive transition. So the role of government is not to do this work for us, it's up to us to do it. The role of government, which I think in this case we must fully support, is to set the conditions and to get rid of the toxicities and what we're doing. For example, why aren't we turning manufacture now to low-cost ventilator production? The IP's out there, it's spreading around the world, let's do it. Yeah. You know, and testing. Why don't we use South African engineering companies and turn them to that? It's happening elsewhere in the world, we can do it too. So those are some of the initiatives that's worth doing. And I'm not blind to the short-term consequences of needing to do a lot of financial engineering in companies to keep them alive through this.
Thanks all. Before we come back to the questions, perhaps an opportunity for Sean to perhaps comment on interfacing with the South African government, but then equally giving us an update from a UK DIT perspective and talking about democracy, you know, the cradle of all democracies, perhaps. Sean, can we hear from you?
Thanks, Leon. Am I coming through?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Perfect. Yeah, great. Well, good afternoon. All really good to be connecting this way, and thanks to Leon and team for setting it up. So, as Leon said, my name is Sean Jordan Kerr, and I head up the UK's Department for International Trade here. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that, you know, we, along with everyone else, are fully sort of cognizant of the impact and the scale and the potential sustained nature of the challenge that we're facing at the moment. We're grappling with it ourselves, and we're helping all of the companies and stakeholders that we engage with to grapple with it as well. I might just touch on quickly the kind of the UK government sort of offer first, and then move to the point about kind of collaboration, engagement with the South African government, and how we can kind of work together. In terms of, you know, what we're trying to do, we're fully cognizant that there'll be huge impact for UK companies and for companies writ large, and that impact will be variable and dynamic as we kind of move forward, and we fully understand what the implications of COVID-19 are going to be. Our support is very much there and freely offered to all UK companies, and recognizing that many companies operate across multiple jurisdictions. It's also kind of offered as part of a conversation, whatever your situation may be. So to all chamber members, please do get in touch if there are things that you think we can help with. Our support is focused primarily in two areas at the moment. Firstly, around supporting the kind of the financial implications of COVID-19, both in terms of the kind of the economic impact it's having, but also in terms of the kind of the trade and investment disruption that it may be causing. There's a package of financial support that's been announced by the Chancellor in the UK. There's further work that we're doing with UK Export Finance, and I really do encourage all businesses where they are struggling or potentially see issues further down the line to get in touch about that. We're also liaising regularly with the South African government to fully understand the implications of the measures that they're bringing in and what impact they're going to have on business and in particular trade and investment. We have an open line to DTI and kind of discussing the sort of the trade and trade policy regulatory issues as well. So again, the kind of an open offer to discuss the specific impacts that they're having. So I think, you know, really an open offer for me and my team in terms of how we can support UK businesses. I think, though, to come on to the point about kind of collaboration, it's a really interesting point. You know, we fully recognise that as government, we absolutely don't have all the answers, nor are we going to have all the answers anytime in the immediate future. This is a new, dynamic and swiftly moving situation for all of us. And I think, you know, our offer is basically we want to hear from the private sector. We want to hear about solutions which are emerging. We want to hear about innovations, creativity. And we see our role as government not as kind of controlling and directing that, but as looking for ways in which we can help support and amplify some of the good stuff which is happening. So John, really interested that you were speaking about kind of, you know, the manufacturing community mobilizing around sort of cheap technology solutions to kind of ventilator production. That's something which is kind of top of our list that we're looking at the moment. You've got, you know, a consortium of business in the UK which is looking to meet UK domestic demand, being kind of supported through the UK's advanced manufacturing catapult, which is basically kind of an accelerator for advanced manufacturing. But we've got UK companies who are eager and committed to help share that know-how and to work with partners across the globe who are looking to do exactly the same thing. And we saw our role as government there to help to facilitate and expedite that process, and where possible mobilize resources through our bilateral development programming or otherwise to help unlock that kind of innovation and that kind of potential. So, you know, I think there really is huge scope for private sector and public sector collaboration here. It's front and center of what we are trying to do, and we don't see ourselves as having all the answers. We want to engage, basically.
Thank you very much, Sean, and great to have you and the DIT supporting us. I think it's just worth mentioning the British diplomatic mission from a trade perspective, but also classical diplomatic perspective, has never been bigger in Africa. So it just shows the UK's commitment to the continent as a future trading partner and a way very much doing business for good. I think, John, will take your observation and then we'll perhaps go back to Cecilia with some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I would echo, without trying to be sort of mealy-mouthed about it, I would echo actually that the UK diplomatic and trade community in South Africa now is the strongest I've ever seen it. Regrettable that Elena left, and I'm sure she's listening. She was a wonderful person as well, but she's doing brilliant work in Cape Town in the communities, and so that's a wonderful example of somebody segueing out of diplomacy into society again. It's the broader community. But
We've actually got Eleanor listening in on this webinar, by the way.
I know. That's why I gave her a mention. Yeah.
I see she's been answering some questions on the chats. Thanks, Eleanor.
So the other point I'd like to make is that maybe one of the greatest contributions that the UK government can make here is apart from the hard innovations, is to really promote this collaboration between business and government and change the mindset, because the way we've been stuck in various attitudes in South Africa for so long has caused a lot of our traumas. So we need to make these changes. You know, none of our kids can prosper unless all of our kids prosper in the future of South Africa, and that's the sort of mentality we have to really get clear. So we have to build prosperity in South Africa, and that can only be done by changing the way we think. And I think the UK government, and it's spread around the world, can give really good lessons and guidance on that as well.
Thanks, John. Perhaps we'll take some questions, Cecilia.
I think on lessons and guidelines also, we did have a question from Carol Graham of Belore Logistics saying that when we look back, we see something like swine flu that so far has had a higher mortality rate, but we know, of course, we're still counting. No one knows how this is going to end. Did not have such a big global reaction. Do we think that any lessons were learned from swine flu when it happened? And why do we think? I think I've answered a little bit on the chat group, but my thoughts are that really the growth of social media and its influence has greatly impacted how the world has responded to this. But certainly I think there's an interesting case. What did we learn from the other recent outbreaks of SARS and MERS and the likes of swine flu that we've applied so far, and maybe some lessons that we haven't yet applied?
Yeah, I mean, look, I seem to be starting on all the very negative answers here. But hey, I'm really positive. But again, I'm going to say I don't think much. So firstly, if you look at all these, other diseases through history, the swine flus and, Ebola and, I don't know, go back to before I was even born. Without question, they're not comparable. Either they weren't transmitted at the same rate, or the symptoms would occur much faster, so that there was no question. When you were sick, you were straight into the hospital so that you could diagnose and quarantine people quicker. If you go back 100, 150 years, obviously we didn't have the flights which were transmitting people able to become transmitters across the globe. I mean, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this. And if you haven't seen it, I think just go back a few years and watch Bill Gates be a lot more articulate about that particular question than I am at the moment. And he's very clear. It's a little 8-minute TED talk, and he says that the lessons haven't been learned. We are not geared up for a pandemic like this. If something like COVID-19 were to occur, we haven't got our models in place. We don't have a World Health Authority with the necessary power to do anything. There's no government action, which is a bit like a NATO equivalent, but here for a virus rather than protection, in place to go and have all of the communities and all of the countries working together simultaneously to go and deal with it. So I think the simple answer is we haven't learned from these historical illnesses. What I do hope, and I think is, I really looking forward, I think we're going to learn off this one. It is so impactful, so disastrous, so massive, and they can now put a price point on it. It's not just about the lives, it's about the demolishing of whole economies which are going to be in recession for years. The systemic nature of it, in the same way they had to deal with the banking crisis. And if you use that as a proxy, the banking crisis, I think you can expect significant policy and structural changes across governments and financial institutions and other important institutions to go and put a much better protection mechanism in if something like this was to go occurring again at some point in the future, now that we've lived it.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Colin. I spoke to a lady who's a registrar for emergency medicine at Groote Schuur Hospital, who told me that the thing is, in a public hospital in South Africa, at any given day of the week, we are over capacity. There are no ICU beds. If you look to private, some capacity, but barely. And this is the crisis. On any normal day without a pandemic, and this has been the case for years and years. And I think, I hope, and I tend to agree with you, hopefully there will be policy shifts and you know, a real kick up the backside to say we've been underinvesting in medical skills, science skills, the pay scales, the whole system, I think, has not been geared for this for years. Although all the warning signs have been there, it's been in crisis for very long, yet it's just been ignored and it's been assumed as normal.
So that's a lovely segue into our next topic, Cecilia. I know that's something we've discussed over the last few days and even yesterday in our preparation for this webinar. We can look to the UK, you know, a developed country, 6th in the world according to GDP, and Operation NHS Nightingale, and the way society has come together. The military's been deployed. We've had 400,000 volunteers for 25,000 spaces to address this pandemic. However, one could argue that's because for the last 10 years, we've had 10 years of underinvestment and obviously far more greater GDP, but we have similar challenges and the NHS is at breaking point. That said, are we going to take the learnings from this particular pandemic? We've looked at what this might mean societally, politically, philosophically. Let's now, for the next session and the rest of the session, what does that mean for us, our individual businesses? How are we going to navigate this change? How are we going to moderate the way we work? And equally, it'd be great to hear from members, areas. Let's start with what you're struggling with and what you're trying to get your heads around. And then we'll conclude on some real good news stories, of which we have a few that we can share with all our members today. And as you know, we're a realistic, challenging voice in the chamber. But Colin, I don't think you're being too negative. I think you're being real. But we're going to end on some optimistic notes. But let's perhaps explore some of those challenges right now. And yesterday we were talking, and you know, Venice, Leslie, Nemo were on the call as well. We were talking about never letting a good crisis go to waste. So we flip this on its head as a challenge and look at the opportunities. Perhaps starting with you, John, what do you see as some of these opportunities from a kind of more tactical, operational perspective?
And just before you start, John, just for everyone that's attending, if you want to talk on that particular question, just hold up your hand if you can find the button, and then I'll work out how to get you roped in so that you can actually, everyone else can hear you.
Thanks, Colin.
That would be really brilliant to hear some other voices. It's please do, if you can, chip in. We're all keen to hear. To answer your question, Leon, three things straight away. The first thing is, I mean, some of us came from cold climates when we were brought up, and some of us were in the military. And you all know when you're sitting there getting colder and colder that you go into exposure. And what happens is you start shivering, the blood goes from your extremities and to keep the center of your body warm. And in a sense, that's the whole idea of what's happening to companies now is how do you keep the entity going? And what do you shed, leave, and do without enormous social consequence? So the first stage is just keeping yourself going, keeping yourself alive. It's an absolute duty, in my view, to keep your company going, because if companies crash, what economy are we going into? So we have to work out how to triage, to come down, to limit the company, to let it survive through with the minimum damage. And there's something that we as a community can really share with each other. We've got enough brains in this lot to advise the country. Without being arrogant, I mean, I think we really do. The people listening here and the High Commission, etc., and yourselves. The second thing is what do we do now? Do we just try and survive, or do we know that we are going to come into an upswing? And what disaster will we be in by the time we get there? So if you can transform the companies into online trading and other things, then do it, but do it aggressively, do it energetically, do it with passion, because we need that. And we need to build those companies and hold them and transform them and get the skills in place. So when things do get, A, it won't get as bad if we can maintain employment in different ways. It's about ingenuity. And B, we'll recover better. There's an old saying is, ladies and gentlemen, we have no money, so we have to think. You know, and it's time now is to really be thinking. And it's not about resources, it's about resourcefulness. So let's trigger our resourcefulness, get it going, let go of some of the strictures and disciplines that we believe are so necessary, and experiment. This is a great time, and we will recover better. So those are a couple of the really important things to do in this stage. And then, of course, the truth is that this is not going to last 21 days. It's not going to last 42 days. It's probably not going to last 60. It's probably going to last 6-8 months. The British schools aren't opening until September, I gather. So what's going to happen here? We're in for a longer haul. And that's not an apocalyptic scenario. That's just, as Norman Adamy from SAB used to say, is make reality our friend. So that is the probable truth, that this is going to last longer. How do we manage ourselves and help people through that? And how do we ensure that we don't get to positions of massive social unrest? Let's avoid that by being very proactive. This is not a holiday. We're not on holiday. If anything, we're now going to have to work much harder than we ever have done before in order to get ourselves to a good position afterwards.
Thank you, John. I really hope you're wrong about the 6-8 months, but you know, words of wisdom there. Colin.
Yeah, look, I think the first thing that all business leaders, and look, it actually doesn't matter whether you're just from an individual perspective or a business perspective, you've got to go and start thinking forwards and working backwards. And you might find it difficult to imagine what the world is going to be like in 12 months or 24 months, but it's the right place to start. So for example, John just mentioned social unrest. Do you think there is a significant chance in South Africa and across Africa there will be social unrest? Okay, you can take that as a probable scenario and then do nothing about it. That's your worst case scenario, and just wait for it to occur and then try to deal with it. Your better case scenario is you can take that as a possibility and start planning for it in how you're going to deal with that if it were to occur. That's slightly better. But where I see the real front runners are the ones that sit there and say, we've got to stop that from happening because it's a likely probability. And therefore, if we're in certain businesses, what can we do to actually avoid that? So if I'm in if I'm a Mediclinic, for example, what am I doing today to try to prevent that scenario from occurring? Because at the end of the day, it's going to cost me a lot of money to do it today, but actually it's a massive, massive saving of being bankrupt and not having a business in the future. And I think that it's that kind of thought process that we need more from, you know, particularly the people with power sitting in the C-suite, to actually really think forward, and rather than just waiting for it to occur, to start thinking about the investment they could make today to stop that from actually happening. And you can look at numerous examples. What are Nando's doing at the moment with all their shops, you know, closed down? And they may already be doing this, but are they actually out there using this as a marketing opportunity, taking their 20,000 staff out to try to go and still produce and deliver food for people that are finding difficult to access? It's a huge loss leader. But if they've got the capital and reserves to do it, I'd call it a marketing expense, because in 6 months' time, just think about the goodwill that they're going to get. Or if you're in an IT and tech firm, or if you're offering some sort of work from home service, how can I go and offer that for free to people today to go and expand my, effectively, the people that know about me, so that we're in a good space, you know, in 6 to 12 months' time. So some industries aren't going to get through this, right? I use one example is probably Edcon and Edgar's. I don't see how they're going to get through this. But at the end of the day, they were already in trouble, and I think shopping centres and a lot of shops are in trouble already because behaviours were changing, but changing slowly as technology, augmented reality starts to come online, and we're going to start doing more and more from home. That's the projection. Now that's just been squashed into just a matter of weeks where we just can't go to the shops. What do you do?
Colin, it strikes me, Edcon is almost, it resembles, it's a very good metaphor for what we've seen with COVID. Older institution, vulnerable, underlying health conditions going to be taken out by a novel virus.
That's right. So bad businesses and businesses that were already starting to die are going to die incredibly quickly, unless they're the few that happen to benefit from this because they're in some sort of health or online type space. But the majority of bad businesses are going to find this really problematic. But what they could do, obviously, is sit there, you know, it's a bit late for them, but other retailers can use this opportunity and say, well, this is a proxy of what's going to happen in the future. So how do we get into the VR space and start offering much better online shopping experiences for people, in the view that we will see virtual reality being quite a cheap commodity in the next 2, 3 or 4 years?
Thanks, Colin. I really like that analogy around the vulnerable and underlying health issues, because it talks to some of the practical advice we can give each other as individuals around what we can do to stay sane and navigate this crisis. But essentially, a lot of the businesses that are going to suffer and fail, and without belittling any of the audiences or our own kind of pains at the moment, we're all nervous. But there are those businesses that were failing to adapt to the new world. The world is becoming more VUCA, more exponential, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous before COVID struck. All that's happened is COVID has accelerated the speed of which we must innovate, or the speed of which we're going to become obsolete. So I think the EdCon analogy with the large proportion of the victims of COVID is really kind of on point. Perhaps, Cecilia, we can have a look at some of the questions before we move this on. If any of the audience members are sharing their key concerns, or indeed anything else.
I think we've covered most of the questions by now, Leon. I don't see any more. I did have a question from Rita Bile about whether this webinar is being recorded and will be available to share afterwards, and I believe it will be. But correct me if I'm wrong, Colin. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, perhaps we can then kind of slide in, and Colin, I'm thinking of maybe 1 or 2 final questions we can pose our audience as we end towards the latter part of our inaugural webinar. Perhaps we could hear about what people would like to know of more going forward. It is our plan to do these at least once a week, and equally, I'd encourage you all, when we share the webinar afterwards, we'll give you an opportunity to sign up to a WhatsApp broadcast channel where we can give you live updates from Sean and his team at DIT, because there are some really good initiatives there that might be the lifeline that our organizations need, helping organizations like Terence navigate the public sector, be that here or in the UK. And I know you know the DIT well, Terence. And equally updates from consular issues. We have a few regularly. But perhaps then moving into some more practical elements of the way we can navigate this crisis, but perhaps sharing some good news stories. What are the silver linings? And I believe there are some people that can find a cloud in every silver lining. Every cloud, I believe, does have a silver lining. So what are we seeing? I suppose silver linings, opportunities, good news stories that we're emerging from our members. So please share the members online. We have a few, but equally, what are you seeing on a more broader level? Perhaps I can ask the fellow panelists.
I would love to know, Leon, from everyone listening, what are if you had to suggest 3 things we should do right now, 3 most important things, what would they be? If you if you put them on the chat or the Q&As or something, we'll actually have a really good list of suggestions, because you've got I'm looking through the participants, it's a phenomenal group of people there, and they're going to have wonderful insights, and that might be helping us not only build an agenda for future programs, but decide what to do. Yeah.
John, we've got an interesting comment from James Elkington, again in Cape Town. Do you think that this time will reverse some effects of globalization? James thinks that we will. And if so, what opportunities do we see for South Africa, particularly in this?
Well, it depends what he means by reversing effects of globalization. For example, that's exactly what Donald Trump's been trying to do for a while, and maybe that's not where we want to go. What I think he means by that is some of the toxic effects on disparities of income, environmental effects, and the other things that are all going to leave a world which our kids grow up into, and we grow up into, actually. It's so immediate. So yes, I think it will. There is a strong underbelly movement across many nations now, which is about the need for global collaboration. Global problems we're having are hard to solve with national governments or moribund global communities or international agencies. So we have a desperate need to create new forms of movements, new forms of global engagement, which don't exist well at the moment, which are being piloted. So I think this will accelerate that. I don't think we should get too hyperbolic about it or too fanciful or too emotive about it. Truth is, that's going to be really hard work. When you're trying to get people collaborating around these huge issues, it's going to cause enormous strain. So one of the things we really need to get to grips with is battling fake news and false facts, etc. And Finland's done good work on that. We also need to do that. It needs to be central to how we think. We need to develop discernment, and equally need to develop the capacity for collective action, seeing common humanity. That there is no science of race or whatever. It doesn't exist. We're all the same people. So we need to start acting in that way. And I think it will propel that. I don't think it's new. I think it's there. I think it will catalyze it and make it more able to grow. What do you think?
I'm just the question that always comes back to me, if we say we can't look to government to solve our problems or to do the work for us, which I think we all would agree on, and that's indeed what many companies are doing, but then the results are blocked by regulation. We seem to be in an increasingly regulated world where government regulates but doesn't solve any problems. So should we be moving away then from less regulation and let people solve the problems?
Okay.
Or not? Is it too big a risk to take?
I'll quickly answer that and then pass it over to Colin, who's probably got a much better answer. No, I don't think we should be moving away from regulation. I think we should have really good regulation. And regulation is critical. We shouldn't have rubbish and stuff that hangs in there for decades like a superstition. I mean, you get rid of this stuff. And secondly, it's about use of money. It is, the idea of profit is something we argue with. Money is a really useful thing. We need to develop people who use money really well. And we need to give money to those people who can use it really well. We've got to keep it out of the hands of people who use it selfishly and badly. So it's a simple thing. So regulation, using money, learning how to do those things, being friends with money, and putting it in the right places are critical. So we need to get rid of rubbish regulation, and we need to stop being superstitious about it.
Colin?
Yes, look, I mean,
Please disagree.
No, I can't believe
Now's your chance.
No, he does.
I think about the number of fights I've had over the years with regulators, but anyway, the reality is, I mean, as individuals, and there's no insults here, I think it's just the facts of life. As individuals, we're selfish. When we form into organizations, we're selfish. And that's perfectly acceptable. We have to be. It's all part of survival, and nothing I think is going to change that. I just don't see it happening. So you have to have structures and institutions in place to protect you, I suppose, from yourselves, to try to go and focus on solving for where that kind of self-directive that we all do is brought together so that the community and society as a whole benefit. So, and in a totally connected world, this becomes even more important. I think for me, what COVID-19 highlights, and isn't a surprise, and is going to happen many times over, is just how bad our organizations are at filling the gaps for things that haven't happened and are somewhat unimaginable. So I'll give you an example on that one. Soon we're going to need huge amounts of regulation and support from governments around the world because of another reason for people losing their jobs, which will be artificial intelligence. So if we're moving into a world where it's not a virus which is restricting people's ability to work, it's now autonomous everything, autonomous cars, autonomous teachers, lecturers, analytics, and you're suddenly seeing everyone from doctors to Uber drivers no longer having a role. What is the structure that's being put in place to go and handle that? Now, what I hope happens is that something like this is going to firstly inspire governments and organizations to go and make sure the protections are in place so something like this is less likely to occur again. And if it does, it can be handled more efficiently with less deaths and less cost to humanity. But I also hope it's a real reminder that it's, you think about other times in history, there is no NATO until there's a war. We don't worry particularly about structures for nuclear weapons until the sort of Cuban crisis. So we've now got this viral crisis. I hope it really gets politicians today in the next 5 to 10 years, and governments and organizations, NGOs, etc., to start thinking outside of the box about other things that are coming down the track, which we do need to regulate for and have new institutions in place to go and support. Another good example is what happens if the internet goes down? What happens if everyone goes and nationalizes their own internet and starts to go and to manage it in a different way? Again, huge negative implications, no real structures seemingly in place to go and deal and manage those types of issues. So I hope better regulation, which is more thoughtful about managing the downside consequences that individuals don't necessarily worry about too much because they're just too far side, and more supportive regulation to encourage people to innovate and to experiment and to develop, a little bit like what we're seeing now with open source releases of how to build everything from a detector, an immune system detector, 5 minutes and we can see if you've got COVID-19, to a new type of ventilator from a Dyson or a General Motor, and 101, 1,001 other companies that are now doing the innovation work here.
Yeah. Yeah, agree. So we've actually had some lovely responses from members around the question of what 3 things can we do immediately to get through this. Amanda Wild from Mzinzi Healthcare has come up with 3 really nice ones. Resisting the urge to react and find the silver lining instead. Focus the team on the possible and help them to find their passion and purpose, and resist retrenching and not paying, and try to focus instead on creating the momentum for a positive recovery. Angel Jones from Homecoming Revolution has said we can focus on listening rather than selling. Use the downtime well to interact differently with our clients and our employees. And Marissa Jacobs from Expat Web is saying 3 things we can do now is to innovate our business models, learn to manage a remote team and keep them engaged, and keep contact with clients and their current status, continue to engage. So I think a strong message coming across is everybody is definitely grabbing this whole innovation thing. But everybody still wants to engage. We're still humans. Everybody wants the contact. I think we're all going to see how it plays out, but some great input from some of our members.
That's brilliant. Yeah. More.
Yeah. Thank you. Perhaps sorry, John, I'm just jumping in. And thank you very much for the levels of engagement. And a big part of this is ensuring that we maintain our community and connection in terms of going forward as a chamber and navigating these challenging times. But I'd like to talk about some positives and actually some advice. I've been advising several businesses around the world over the last few weeks. One of my Zoom sessions covered 9 time zones, and it is really interesting. I think what we need to remember is, our response of, reconnecting with our humanity, which really is about driving our purpose as well. But equally from a commercial perspective, and breaking it down to, as somebody that's run small and medium-sized businesses, and as the chamber, we indeed are doing that. We need to remember that people have long memories, and the way we treat our customers and the way we treat each other and our staff and our children. We can see Cecilia is educating a younger boy there and how to navigate a webcast. And that's something we've all had to learn to do in the last few weeks. I can assure you, managing dogs and children whilst trying to work in our houses. But the markets, the customers, the clients, and your staff are going to remember how we behaved as individuals and as organizations. So those that ruthlessly shut their doors, I know of several instances in Dubai, a British company, where people turn up and they've locked the doors because they've got a year's revenue in the bank, and they'd rather keep that and go on holiday than keep their business going. To me, that's not a business critical decision. That's almost like a selfish, short-sighted decision. And there are other organizations that are doing everything. We were chatting to Amanda yesterday. They're doing everything to ensure that they can look after their people. Because as John says, if we don't ensure that our businesses survive, what type of economy come back to? So I think it's worth remembering that how we behave as leaders and as corporates, as individuals throughout this crisis will determine our brand equity going forward into the new world. And again, I saw Angel just reinforcing that comment. It really is an opportunity to listen and engage to our customers, but also to reflect on ourselves and how we're going to adapt our business moving forward. And within all this, within this shifting world, there are great examples of where I believe business and science can interact and actually solve some of these societal problems. And we want to create this ecosystem whereby business comes together to solve problems. And I'm going to summarize with a few points on that in about 15 minutes. But there's an organization called Afrobodies, which our very own Ema is involved with. And they're a South African business currently looking at testing vaccines and immunotherapy. So John talked about, and Colin talked about, businesses repurposing themselves to adapt to the crisis. Be it Dyson, be it AB InBev, actually shifting the whole manufacturing piece to developing hand gels. So within this, there are great opportunities for agile SMEs to seize this new market and solve societal problems. And I'm not hearing enough of this in the press. So I think it's incumbent of all of us to share these good news stories as and when we see them. The other thing is about community and interdependence. And as a chamber, we have a massive network of businesses, but behind us, we have the DIT and the British High Commission. And I have been very impressed over the last 4 or 5 days, from midnight to 7 in the morning, just being involved in what the High Commission and Sean's team and the DIT are doing in terms of ensuring British people can be expatriated, looking after people that are stranded. And again, it shows that, very proud to be part of a government and an organization that has indeed those kind of partners. So I think it's just worth reminding. And I think, again, another silver lining has perhaps been looking at how our president has been incredibly statesmanlike in addressing this challenge, which, you can see the strain on Boris Johnson's face, who is suffering from COVID himself, along with his key ministers and chief medical officer. We can just see the strain on world leaders. But again, it underlines the importance of leadership, because where we can see in a world where there's been a leadership vacuum, where the economy is suffering the most and where the transmissions are increasing the most, versus the organizations and countries that are well led, that are navigating this much better. Again, this gives us case studies for the kind of models of leadership that perhaps we should be teaching and advising on going forward. So just some observations of good practice going on there. Don't know, John, if perhaps you could comment on some of the things you've seen as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's about humanity. I mean, what do you want to be? So we sit here and we're worried about, of course, our livelihoods, our families, the money, but how do you want to look back on this and what you did? And humanity isn't some altruistic thing. It's looking at Cecilia and her kid, and seeing us all in these different contexts. We're seeing ourselves in different ways now, and those are good ways. I think we give this sort of this sort of image, this strange portrayal of who we are, mostly in businesses. And I think that's sometimes necessary because we have to be very focused, etc. But this is about collaboration, about the human condition and who we're doing. And I think we have to sustain and build our humanity and help each other. And I think surely that's the purpose, one of the biggest points of society anyway. It's certainly not about becoming richer and richer. It's about having a better quality of life and thriving well. So I think that's coming to the fore quite a lot, and you're starting to see people pull together on that. The question in everyone's mind is, well, we're just going to go straight back to where we were before. Why should that be the case? I think the global challenges we're facing are big enough to make us want to not do that. This is COVID-19. It's bad enough. It could be a lot worse. There are other consequences that will inevitably happen with population growth and if we don't collaborate more. So it's not difficult to work this out. So how are we going to use this to walk out and say, I did something that mattered? And not just for other people, for our businesses as well, because businesses aren't about profit, they're about creating value for people to make their lives better, for which people give you money, for which you need surpluses so that you don't become a drain on everyone else. You shouldn't have to just be pocketing and making more and more wealth. Not that I'm against wealth, I'm not. So I think what we're facing now is quite a deep ontological sort of challenge to the way we've seen life. And I think that matters not in a philosophical thing. I think it matters in the immediacy of what we do now, tomorrow, and the day after. So let's get going. If we don't build our businesses, if we don't keep things going, if we don't innovate, if we don't try and make this stuff continue, then we're not serving anybody. We're leaving disaster behind us. So it's a great challenge. I think this is forcing us to go into areas we should have done before, and let's embrace it. You know, we might go down in flames, but maybe we won't.
Thank you, John. I didn't think we'd get onto metaphysics, but we have. Fantastic on the ontological piece there. Perhaps, Cecilia, there's some final comments we could share. Then perhaps we can have concluding comments from Colin, and we can talk about follow-ups and next steps.
No, I think just agree with John completely. This is an opportunity to maybe take seriously things that we've been speaking a lot about, and it becomes more than just a poignant quote on social media and on Pinterest, but now's the time to really entrench it into our businesses. I was reminded this morning of a Robert Louis Stevenson quote that said, "Don't judge every day by the harvest you reap, but by the seeds that you plant." So I think this is a time for us to sow some more seeds and to harvest when a crisis is over. But at the same time, I don't think a crisis is ever really going to be over. After this, there will be the next thing. There's going to be something, whether it's a form of a virus or another economic recession, it's always going to be there. So I think tying in with what you said, be ready for the crisis and keep sowing the seeds that can grow no matter what crisis comes, as far as is possible to predict.
Thank you, Cecilia. And Colin, any final observations from yourself?
No, absolutely none at all. I mean, I hope everyone out there really stays safe. Winston Churchill never let a good crisis go to waste. This is certainly a very big crisis. And it's most of the thought process is obviously negative, and it's terrible in so many ways. But nonetheless, as businesses and individuals, and just the way that we are as humans, we've got to look forward and imagine that place in a year or two's time where this is becoming a memory. It won't be a distant memory for many, many decades. But use it as such. Use it to inspire your teams. Use it for purposeful leadership. Use it to reinvent yourself. Use it to go and explore innovation in a way to prepare yourself for the next crisis that comes through this technology tsunami that's coming through and washing over industries and businesses. And obviously use it to go and experiment with building that excitement from your staff, your customers, your other stakeholders, your shareholders, so that you've got that support and you become a stronger organization if you can get through this. Rather than just sitting there and looking at everything from a particularly negative and downside sort of perspective. And certainly that's what I'm trying to do with my business. And I think that's what the best organizations that are being publicized on reports and on social media are doing as well.
No, thank you, Colin. And in terms of summarizing, thank you everyone for joining us and participating in our first webinar. We will send out the recorded version to you, and really please do engage with us and interact in terms of giving us feedback about how we can do this better. We intend to do it regularly, and if you want to partner with us as a panelist, we can interview you, we can celebrate something you're doing, we can talk about good ways of navigating this. Please do reach out. We're also not averse to the odd virtual glass of wine, which we trialed yesterday evening, and maybe we can do that on a larger scale. I think it's really important. And to summarize, I really like the Robert Louis Stevenson quote. In a session I was partaking in yesterday, somebody spoke about, this is the tilling of the earth. It's an opportunity for us to till that earth so we can reharvest and replant. But we've got to survive while we're doing that. So what is our purpose? Let's be clear about it as an organization. If individuals, we can connect to that, we will stay motivated. Interdependence, in the post-Brexit, post-Trump scenario, we're actually realizing how interdependent we are as a people, as a society, and as a chamber. We're going to lean on each other. So please don't be afraid to ask for help. If you're struggling, if you're feeling you're in a dark place, just reach out to us, because if it's not me and my team that are on the call, it's going to be one of our board or one of our members or one of our stakeholders at the DIT or indeed the British High Commission. So please reach out to us and we will stay connected and help you where we can. It's a time to be innovative and embrace innovation. And as John and Colin both intimated, that's making sure we bring our complete selves to work. whatever coming to work looks like these days, and giving our staff the freedom to express themselves and share ideas. And I think that's going to get great levels of engagement. And yet, looking to government can be incredibly frustrating. I think of Terence's point, but we are connected with BUSA, we are connected with the DTI here, but most importantly, with Sean and his team and the High Commissioner, we do have some influence there. I think just most importantly, people, please stay safe. Please look after yourselves and each other and your families. And if we can look after our neighbor, so that's one step better, that's everything we could do. And I just think one top tip, something I've enjoyed, a silver lining in this, now that I'm not commuting to Southampton or Cape Town or Dubai or London at all, we've got a few extra hours in a day to fit in some exercise. And I think if we can stay fit, stay healthy, we're going to be fit to fight, survive and thrive, and take on this COVID challenge and indeed whatever challenges are thrown at us over the coming months. Thank you so much for engaging with us. Thank you so much to Colin, to John, to Cecilia, and thank you to Ema, Venice and Leslie behind the scenes for bringing this together. I should say thank you to Kirsty Wallace as well, John. I'll make sure we thank her. Please, thank you for the feedback. That's 100% enjoyment. Thank you very much. We will endeavour to improve, to stay relevant and stay connected, look after each other, and we'll be in touch very soon. Thank you very much, everyone.